Elisa's heart hammered in her chest, the rhythmic sound almost drowned out by the screeching train wheels as the engines screeched to a halt. She stepped down onto the dry, cracked earth of the station platform, the hot wind whipping at her hair, stinging her face like a slap. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting a shimmering heat across the empty stretch of land before her. It was nothing like the small town she'd come from. Here the air tasted of dust and isolation thick with the weight of forgotten dreams. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, glancing around at the emptiness. Not a single person in sight. No man in a dusty hat, no sign of a waiting wagon or familiar face. She'd been expecting something, a greeting, a smile, someone to help her with the heavy bags she carried. But instead, all she saw were the wind-blown remnants of a place lost in time, forgotten by most. The train's whistle faded behind her, and the silence crept in. It was then that Elisa noticed them, the 7 children. They stood in a neat line, not a word spoken, staring at her with eyes wide and silent. She had read the letter from Dakota Yazzie a dozen times over during the long journey. The promise of a new life, a husband who was kind and hard-working, someone who would give her the home she had dreamed of. And here she was in a strange town, in a strange land, greeted not by a husband, but by these children, thin, dusty, and broken. Her stomach twisted. The oldest, a boy of maybe 12, stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He held a baby wrapped in a tattered blanket in his arms, the child's face pressed into his chest, oblivious to the world around him. Elisa's throat went dry. "Are you Elisa Callahan?" The boy's voice was steady, flat, as if delivering a message he had recited 1,000 times. Elisa nodded, her pulse quickening. "Yes, I am." Her voice trembled barely above a whisper. She forced herself to take a step forward, her bags weighing heavily in her hands. The boy didn't smile. Instead, his eyes dropped to the ground for a moment. Then he lifted them again, a look of grim understanding in his gaze. "Dakota is dead," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "What?" Elisa gasped, her heart lurching in her chest. "No, that's not possible. He wrote to me. We were going to—" 3 days ago, the boy interrupted. "Snakebite. We buried him ourselves." His voice was as hard as the land around them, as if the pain of what had happened was something he had learned to live with long ago. "He wrote to you when he was sick. He said you'd come anyway." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elisa's feet. Her hand instinctively pressed against her chest, as though trying to hold herself together. The letter, the promise, the life she had imagined, all of it crumbled in an instant. "I don't understand," Elisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand." The boy, who she now realized was the eldest, stood there for a moment silent. Then he spoke again, his words weighted with something Elisa couldn't quite grasp. "We don't have anyone else. We're all that's left. No one else came. Just you." The other children stood motionless, their faces drawn with the weight of a grief too big for their small frames. 2 girls clung to each other, their faces a mix of sadness and something else Elisa couldn't name. A little boy, his face streaked with dirt, held a scrap of cloth close to his chest, like it was his only treasure. The baby, still sleeping in the arms of the oldest boy, seemed to be the only one unaware of the gravity of the moment. A knot formed in Elisa's throat as she looked at them, all these children who had been left to carry on without a parent, without a guide. She had come here seeking a future, a new beginning, and instead, she was standing at the edge of a shattered family, expected to step into shoes she hadn't known existed. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice shaking as she took a step closer, but the boy didn't answer immediately. His gaze was distant, as though the weight of his responsibility was too much for his young shoulders. After a long pause, he slowly lowered his gaze and took a step toward the horizon. "There's a house," he said. His voice soft now, almost apologetic. "Not much, but it's all we have." He motioned toward the distant hills, and Elisa followed his finger to see a ramshackle structure in the distance, barely more than a silhouette against the blinding sun. A house that looked as forgotten as the land itself. Without another word, the boy turned and began to walk his bare feet, kicking up the dry dust as he moved, the rest of the children following behind him like a quiet procession. Elisa's feet felt rooted to the ground, her heart still racing, caught between a deep instinct to run and the overwhelming pull to stay. For a long moment, Elisa stood frozen, watching the children walk away. It felt as though the entire weight of the world had suddenly been placed on her shoulders. She had imagined a warm embrace, a loving husband, a home. Instead, she was here in this vast, unyielding land, with nothing but 7 orphaned souls who needed her in ways she could hardly comprehend. The wind picked up again, sending a swirl of dust into the air, and Elisa took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't sure why she had come here. She wasn't sure why she had chosen to leave everything behind. But as the sound of the children's footsteps echoed in the distance, she knew she couldn't leave now. Something inside her, something she couldn't name, had already tied her to this place. Taking one last glance at the empty station behind her, Elisa picked up her bags and followed the children. The path ahead was uncertain, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her chest. But there was no turning back. Not now. The house loomed larger with each step she took, its crooked roof and sagging walls like a symbol of everything that had brought her here, the promise of a new life now shattered, but still a life to be lived. And as she walked behind the children, the sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the land. This was her life now, whether she was ready or not. And there was no way to know what lay ahead, only that it was a future she had never imagined. But for the first time, Elisa understood her journey had just begun. Dakota had lived a quiet life, but not without shadows. Now his journal lay before Elisa, filled with confessions of a man who had lost as much as he had built, and the secrets that should have stayed buried, threatened to undo the fragile life Elisa had just entered. The house smelled of dust and neglect. Elisa could feel the weight of the air, thick with silence, pressing in on her as she stepped over the threshold. The children, still following the eldest boy, had quietly settled into the small living area. The space, despite its dilapidated state, was a home, at least it had been once. Elisa took a moment to look around. The cracked walls, the faded rugs, and the old wooden beams above her all seemed to whisper memories of the family that had lived here. Dakota's family. The boy Noah had already started to put the baby down on the floor, near a small, worn cradle made of what looked like twisted branches. The other children, though they hadn't spoken, went about their business with a quiet efficiency, as if they had done this many times before. Elisa set her bags down by the door and looked at them, uncertain. She felt the weight of her responsibility growing heavier with each passing second. She had imagined arriving at a bustling home, the warm embrace of a man who had written her those letters, assuring her of a new life, a new start. Instead, she found herself standing in front of 7 children, staring back at her with a kind of grim acceptance that made her heart ache. There was no time for grief, no time for understanding, only survival. Noah, the eldest, walked over to a small table, his bare feet making little sound against the rough wooden floorboards. Elisa followed him, and he pulled a journal from a leather bag that was slung over his shoulder. "This was my father's," he said quietly, holding the book out to her. "He wanted you to have it." Elisa hesitated before reaching out for the journal. She felt a strange knot form in her stomach, part dread, part curiosity. The boy's eyes were serious as he watched her, his hands shaking just slightly as he handed over the well-worn book. She could feel the weight of Dakota's life in the leather cover, as though it had absorbed every moment of the past years. She opened the journal carefully, turning the yellowed pages one by one. The handwriting was messy, hurried at times, but Elisa could make out most of the words. Some were familiar to her, reminders of the promises Dakota had made to her in his letters, but others written in a tone far darker than the hopeful words in the letters made her heart pound in her chest. The entries spoke of hard years of trading and working, of trying to survive in a land that had little to give. There were mentions of family disputes, tensions with his brother Amarog, conflicts with the settlers who were beginning to encroach on the land. But it was the last few pages that stopped Elisa cold. One entry dated a month before Dakota's death read, "I've made mistakes. The land is mine, but not in the way I thought. Amarog will never forgive me. I've done things I can't take back, and the settlers, what they want, they'll get. They don't care for us. I only hope that whoever comes after me, Elisa, if she does, will understand. I couldn't protect them, but she can." The words hung in the air around Elisa like smoke. She read them over and over again, her eyes scanning the page, trying to find meaning in what Dakota had written. She felt like an intruder reading the private thoughts of a man who had been more than just a stranger. He had been her future, the man she had dreamed of. Yet the man she was reading about now, one filled with guilt and secrets, was nothing like the figure she had imagined. She closed the journal slowly, her fingers lingering on the cover. The weight of it felt unbearable. She had come here to build a life, to find a husband, and start fresh. Instead, she had walked into a family with broken pieces scattered across the land, and Dakota's secrets had become her own to unravel. His words were a burden she hadn't expected to carry. Noah stood watching her, his expression unreadable. He had told her the truth, the cold, harsh truth. Dakota's death was not just the loss of a man, but the loss of a legacy that Elisa now had to figure out how to protect. The land. Elisa began, her voice faltering as she tried to process what she had just read. What did he mean? What is it that I have to protect? Noah didn't answer at first. He just turned away and moved toward the window, peering out over the dry land, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Dakota didn't tell you everything. But the land, it's ours. The settlers want it. They think we don't belong here. But it's ours and we won't leave. Elisa stood there, the journal heavy in her hands. She wanted to say something to reassure the boy, but the weight of the situation was too much. What had she walked into? The future she had imagined was slipping away, replaced by something far more complicated and dangerous. She had no idea how to protect this family. She barely knew how to take care of herself. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Nayeli, the woman from the neighboring village. She had offered to help Elisa adjust to life in Dineta, and Elisa had reluctantly accepted her assistance. She had been too shaken by the discovery in Dakota's journal to think clearly. Now, seeing Nayeli standing in the doorway, Elisa realized she needed help more than she had thought. "I'm sorry," Nayeli said gently. "I didn't mean to interrupt. But there are things that need to be done. The children need food, and there are repairs that can't wait. You can't do it alone." Elisa blinked, startled by the woman's calm demeanor. Nayeli's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of knowing in her eyes, as though she understood what Elisa was going through. "You're right," Elisa whispered, feeling the weight of her situation settle deeper into her bones. She had no choice but to trust this stranger to let her help, because what she was facing was too much for her alone. Nayeli stepped inside, glancing at the journal in Elisa's hands. She nodded thoughtfully. Dakota was a good man. But the land, it's more than just a home. It's everything to us. And now it's yours to protect whether you want it or not. The words felt like a weight on Elisa's chest. She hadn't come here for any of this. She had come for a life she had imagined in her mind, one full of love and warmth. Instead, she had been thrust into a battle she didn't understand, for a family she barely knew. Nayeli smiled kindly, but there was a sharpness in her eyes. "You'll learn. I'll show you how." Elisa nodded silently, the journal still heavy in her hands. She wasn't sure what she had signed up for, but she knew one thing: she couldn't leave. Not now. Dakota had written to her for a reason, and whatever that reason was, she had to find out. The land might have been Dakota's, but now it was hers to protect. And whatever the cost, she would not let the children face it alone. Nayeli's words echoed in her mind, "You'll learn." And Elisa knew as she stepped away from the window that this journey was only just beginning. The house once a home was now a shell, its walls whispering with the ghosts of past hardships. Elisa could no longer ignore it. The children were not just survivors, they were soldiers in a battle for their future. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Elisa found herself outside standing in front of the dilapidated house that had once been Dakota's home. The wind swept through the dry desert air, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage. It was a quiet morning, the only sound being the faint calls of birds from the distant canyon. But Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that the silence here was heavy with unspoken words, with old memories and unhealed wounds. The children had gone about their morning routine without much fanfare, the older ones preparing what little food they had while the younger ones sat quietly, their eyes always watching, always waiting. Elisa felt their gazes on her as she stood there, her heart twisting with uncertainty. She had come here to find a new life, to build something beautiful, something that would heal the wounds of her past. Instead, she found herself standing in front of a house that was little more than a shell, surrounded by children who had seen more pain than anyone their age should have. Noah approached her, his expression unreadable. He held a small bundle of dried herbs in his hands, the ones his father had once gathered from the canyon. He offered them to Elisa with a slight nod, his eyes still shadowed with the burden of his years. "These will help with the cleaning," he said simply, his voice steady as if he had said these words 1,000 times before. Elisa took the herbs from him, her fingers brushing against his. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time she saw how much of a child he still was. His shoulders were tense, his hands rough, but his eyes, those eyes that had once held so much hope, were now heavy with a burden far too great for someone his age. "How old are you, Elisa?" asked her voice, barely a whisper. Noah hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting over the horizon, as if seeking something in the distance. 13, he said at last. "But I had to grow up faster." Elisa felt a pang in her chest at his words. She could see it now, the hard edges of a child forced to become an adult, the weight of a family's survival on his small shoulders. He wasn't just the oldest of the children. He was their protector, their leader, the one who had to keep it all together. And that responsibility, Elisa realized, wasn't just something that had been passed down to him, it had been thrust upon him, just as it had been thrust upon her. "I'm sorry," she said softly, not sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "I never thought—" "I know." Noah interrupted her, his voice surprisingly soft. He had read the confusion in her eyes. "You didn't expect this, but it's the way things are now. We take care of each other. That's how it works." Elisa nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had come here expecting to take care of herself, to build a life with a husband who would share in the work, who would make her feel safe. Instead, she found herself surrounded by children who had already given everything they had just to survive. And now it was her turn to give. Noah turned and began walking toward the house, and Elisa followed him, her feet dragging against the rough earth. As they entered the house, the sense of abandonment hit her again. The walls were bare, save for a few old pictures that hung crookedly, as if no one had taken the time to straighten them. The furniture was worn with chipped paint and frayed cushions. It was a place that had once been full of life, but now it was only a shadow of what it had been. Elisa felt her breath catch in her throat as she stepped further inside, her eyes scanning the room. The children were already at work. Hania was sweeping the floor with a broom made of twigs, while the younger children were washing dishes, their face focused and serious. It was as if they had learned early on that there was no room for play, no room for anything but survival. Noah led Elisa to this corner where the weaving loom stood, its threads tangled and worn, a testament to Dakota's craft. This is where he worked. Noah said, his voice quieter now. He made blankets, baskets, things to trade, things that kept us fed. Elisa's fingers brushed the worn wooden frame of the loom, and for a moment she felt the presence of Dakota, as if he were still there guiding her hand. It was hard to believe he was gone. His absence filled the space with a heaviness she couldn't quite describe. Noah watched her closely, as though waiting for something, perhaps for her to understand what had been lost, what they had all lost. But Elisa wasn't sure she could grasp it yet. She wasn't sure she could ever understand the weight of the life Dakota had lived, or the responsibilities he had carried. All she knew was that she was here now, and that somehow she had to make it work. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, Noah broke it again. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice low. "The settlers." He paused as if the words weighed more than he could bear. "They want this land. They want it all." Elisa turned to him, her heart pounding. She had been dreading this moment, the moment when the truth about Dakota's land came to light. She had known in the back of her mind that it wasn't going to be as simple as just inheriting a home. But hearing it from Noah, hearing the fear in his voice, it made everything feel more real, more urgent. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Noah's eyes darkened. "They don't care about us. They don't care about the land or what Dakota left behind. They just want what's theirs, what they think is theirs." Elisa swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. The truth was that she hadn't come here to fight. She hadn't come here to defend anything. She had come for love, for a future. But now it seemed like she had been handed a battle won that she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. "We'll fight," Noah said firmly, as if reading her thoughts. "We'll do whatever it takes. We have to." The weight of his words settled over Elisa like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. She wasn't sure she could fight. She wasn't sure she was strong enough. But she couldn't let them down. She couldn't let these children down. As the day wore on, Elisa worked alongside the children, helping with the small tasks that filled their days, washing dishes, preparing food, cleaning the house. There were no moments of laughter, no jokes or light-hearted conversations. It was all practical, all survival. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Elisa felt the exhaustion seep into her bones. She looked out over the dry landscape, her eyes following the line of hills that stretched endlessly into the distance. It was a vast emptiness that seemed to go on forever. And in that moment, Elisa realized something. This wasn't just about the house or the land. This was about them. About these children. This was about survival. She turned back to the house where the children had gathered around the fire. They sat close together, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. She took a deep breath and walked over to them, ready to face the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. She had no choice now. She had to be strong. For them. The wind howled through the canyon as Elisa realized she was not just fighting for survival, but for something much deeper. The ties between the children, the land, and Dakota's legacy were stronger than anything Elisa had prepared for. The morning light slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows on the floor of the house. Elisa woke early, as she had been doing since she arrived. The cold desert mornings were harsh, the warmth of the sun a slow burn that only began to soften the chill as the day stretched on. She felt the weight of the land pressing down on her, as though it was trying to tell her something, to demand something of her. She hadn't come here to be a guardian or a protector, but that was what she had become. The children were already awake when Elisa entered the kitchen. Hanaya, the eldest girl, was cooking a small pot of beans over the fire, while the others quietly arranged themselves around the room. The silence between them was thick, comfortable, yet strained. It was the silence of people who had learned long ago not to speak unless necessary. Elisa moved to help Hanaya with the cooking, but the girl shook her head, her expression guarded. "You don't need to do that," she said softly. "I'll take care of it." Elisa hesitated, feeling the sting of rejection, but then she saw the look in Hanaya's eyes, a mix of pride and sorrow, as if she was trying to protect Elisa from taking on too much. Elisa didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure she could just stand by and let Hanaya do it all, but at the same time she knew the girl needed her space. She had been doing this for so long, surviving for so long, that perhaps she didn't need Elisa at all. Instead, Elisa went to the small corner where the loom stood. She had spent the last few days trying to understand how it worked, trying to understand Dakota's legacy through the threads that had once been his life's work. The loom was a tangle of old strings and worn wood, but Elisa could see how beautiful the pieces must have been when Dakota was in full swing. It wasn't just about weaving blankets and baskets. It was about making something beautiful out of what seemed broken. It was about hope. She sat down on the floor and began to pick at the strings, her fingers fumbling over the rough texture. It was the one thing she could do now. She could learn what Dakota had left behind, and in doing so, maybe she could understand him better. Maybe it would give her a way to help the children, to give them something of value beyond mere survival. The soft scrape of footsteps behind her startled her. She looked up to see Noah standing in the doorway, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elisa could feel the tension in the room, the weight of their shared silence. "I need to tell you something," Noah said, finally, his voice low. "About my father. About what happened." Elisa set the loom down, her heart picking up its pace. She knew this was coming. She had known the moment she had read Dakota's journal that the truth was going to be harder to uncover than she had anticipated. She had hoped that perhaps Noah would be the one to explain things, to guide her through the maze of secrets. But now, standing before him, Elisa felt the enormity of what she had to face. "What happened?" Elisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah took a step forward, his shoulders stiff. "He didn't just die from a snakebite, Elisa," he said, his eyes hardening with the weight of his words. "He died because of the land." Elisa blinked, confusion and fear mixing in her chest. "The land." "What do you mean?" Noah hesitated, his gaze flickering to the children sitting in the other room. They were too far away to hear, but Elisa could sense the weight of his words, the things he was about to say that could change everything. Dakota wasn't just trying to survive. Noah continued, his voice low and tight. He was trying to protect something. Our land. It was never just about living here, Elisa. It was about keeping it ours, keeping it from the settlers. Elisa's mind raced her thoughts, struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of her. She had always known there was tension in the air, a sense of something not quite right, but she hadn't understood the depth of it until now. She had thought Dakota's death was a tragic accident, something that could be explained away. But now, as Noah's words sank in, she realized that Dakota had been fighting for something bigger than just his life. He had been fighting for the future of his family, for the land that had once been his home. And Amarog Elisa asked the name hanging between them, like a dark cloud. What about Dakota's brother? Noah's eyes darkened. Amarog wasn't on our side. He didn't believe in protecting the land. He thought we were better off giving it up, letting the settlers take it. He's always been like that. He's been angry at Dakota for years because he didn't want to just give up. His voice cracked as he spoke, and Elisa could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal he still carried. Elisa let the silence stretch between them as she processed what Noah had just revealed. Dakota's death had been more than a simple tragedy. It had been the culmination of years of conflict, years of standing against forces that sought to take everything away. The children weren't just orphans. They were the last remnants of a family who had tried to protect something that could never be replaced. What are we supposed to do now? Elisa asked, her voice breaking. How do we protect what's left? Noah looked at her, his expression softening for the first time. We fight, just like Dakota did. He stepped closer, his hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. I don't know how much time we have, but we can't give up, not now, not after everything he did for us. Elisa felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. The land wasn't just property. It was the foundation of everything they had, the memories, the history, the future. If they lost it, they would lose everything. It was more than just survival. It was identity. She stood up from the loom, wiping her hands on her skirts. The loom might have been a way to honor Dakota's memory, but the real battle lay outside in the dust and sun and land that stretched beyond the house. She didn't know how to fight, didn't know where to begin, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let the children face this alone. Noah was right. They had to fight. For the land. For their family. For their future. Elisa turned to Noah, her resolve hardening. I'm with you, she said, her voice steady, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. Whatever it takes, Noah's face softened just slightly, and he gave her a small nod. It wasn't a promise, but it was something, an understanding between them. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have a plan. But they had each other, and sometimes that was enough to start a fight. The wind howled through the canyon again, this time louder, as if in agreement. The battle wasn't just about the land. It was about everything they had left to fight for. Elisa stepped outside, feeling the weight of what she had agreed to. The wind tugged at her hair and clothes, but she didn't flinch. The storm had just begun, and she was ready. The land wasn't just dirt and rock, it was a battleground of old wounds, and Elisa felt the scars of those before her with every step she took. The sun had reached its peak by the time Elisa stood at the edge of the mesa, gazing out over the land. It stretched far into the horizon, an expanse of harsh desert and rugged terrain that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The air was dry and hot, the ground beneath her feet cracked and brittle, as though the earth itself had been left to wither. She had never imagined a place like this. The beauty was stark and unyielding, and it both drew her in and repelled her all at once. Behind her the house lay quiet, the children taking refuge in its shadow as the day wore on. They were used to the heat, used to the silence that came with living on land that had been fought over for generations. Elisa had learned more in the last few days than she had ever expected to. Dakota's death, his secret fight to keep the land, had left a mark on her, a weight that seemed to grow heavier each time she thought about it. Noah had told her the truth that Dakota had been more than just a man trying to survive. He had been a warrior fighting not only for his family, but for the very ground they stood on. And Elisa, who had come here seeking a new beginning, now found herself in the middle of a battle she didn't understand, one that threatened to take everything she had left. She turned as she heard footsteps behind her, soft but steady. It was Amarog. His arrival had been inevitable, and now that he was here, Elisa could feel the tension rising in the air. She hadn't spoken to him much since his return. The anger between him and Noah had been palpable, but there was more to it than that. It was as if the land itself had divided them, and they both knew it. Amarog stopped a few paces away from her, his gaze lingering on the same landscape Elisa had been studying. He didn't speak at first, just watched the desert as though trying to find something in the vast emptiness. "It's hard to understand," he said after a long pause, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "This land, what it means, what it's cost." Elisa said nothing, waiting for him to continue. She knew the history between him and Dakota was complicated, filled with old grievances and unspoken words. It was no surprise that Amarog's return felt like a storm on the horizon, a reminder of everything that had been left unsaid. Amarog turned toward her, then his eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing her presence. "Dakota fought for this land," he said, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "But he didn't see the full picture. We can't keep it. Not like this. Not with them coming." "Who are they?" Elisa asked, finally breaking her silence. She had heard the word before, but it had always been spoken with a sense of fear and bitterness. The settlers were a threat, she knew that much, but the full scope of what they wanted remained unclear. Amarog's eyes darkened. The settlers. The ones who think they own everything. They've been eyeing this land for years, and Dakota, stubborn as he was, didn't understand that they were never going to stop. They think they can just take it. Elisa's stomach twisted at the words. She had always known there was conflict, but hearing it laid bare made it feel even more real, more dangerous. The settlers were coming, and the land that had been Dakota's legacy, his fight, his life, was now at the center of a war that Elisa was too unprepared to fight. "Why didn't you help him?" Elisa asked, her voice soft but sharp. "Why didn't you try to stop it, to protect him?" Amarog's face tightened at the question, his hands rough and calloused clenched at his sides. "I couldn't." Dakota thought he could do it alone. He thought that if he stood his ground, they'd leave him be. But it wasn't just the settlers, Elisa. It was the way the land had always been. It's a curse. It divides us. Elisa felt a shiver of unease run through her. She had come to believe that the land was something sacred, something that belonged to the people who lived on it, who worked it. But Amarog's words made her wonder if the land itself wasn't just a battlefield, one that had been fought over for so long that no one knew how to make peace with it anymore. "The children," Elisa said slowly, her mind racing. "They can't be caught in the middle of this. They've already lost everything." Amarog turned his gaze toward the house, his expression softening for just a moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I never wanted them to be caught in it. But the world doesn't care about who deserves it. It doesn't care who suffers." The truth of his words hit Elisa harder than she expected. She had always believed that things could be different, that good people could make a difference. But now, standing in the shadow of Dakota's past, she was starting to understand that the world didn't always work that way. The tension between them hung thick in the air, but it wasn't just between Elisa and Amarog. It was between the past and the present, between a future she had dreamed of and a reality that she couldn't escape. They were all trapped by the land, by its history, by the ghosts of those who had come before them. Dakota had fought to protect it, but now it seemed like the land itself had become their enemy. Elisa turned away from Amarog, her mind spinning. She needed to make a decision, but she didn't know where to start. The settlers were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they took what they wanted. She had to find a way to protect the children, to protect the land. But how? You'll need help, Amarog said behind her, his voice heavy with understanding. I'll help you, but it won't be enough. There's only so much we can do. The settlers are too powerful. They have the law on their side. They'll come for everything. Elisa's heart sank as she turned back to face him. She had hoped for something, some answer, some way out, but now it seemed like there was none. The battle was inevitable, and the cost would be high. I'll do whatever it takes, Elisa said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. We have to protect them. We have to protect the children. Amarog nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. Then we fight. Together. But it won't be easy. And you have to be ready. We don't know what they'll do. Elisa felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. The wind howled through the canyon again, its sound almost like a warning. The battle had begun, and Elisa knew there was no turning back now. The land, Dakota's legacy, and the children, all of it rested on her shoulders. She wasn't ready, not yet. But she had no choice. She would have to find a way, even if it meant fighting against the world itself. With a final glance at Amarog, Elisa turned and began to walk back toward the house. The children were waiting, and whatever came next, she couldn't let them face it alone. With each thread she wove, Elisa felt the fabric of her own soul patch itself together. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about belonging. The days had begun to blur together. Elisa had settled into a rhythm, a routine that was as exhausting as it was necessary. The children, though quiet, were beginning to trust her in small ways. Hanaya had started letting Elisa help with the cooking, though it was clear the girl had taken on the role of caretaker long ago. Noah, ever the protector, was still distant, but Elisa could feel his eyes watching her, studying her, as if waiting for her to prove that she could be trusted. It wasn't just the day-to-day survival that wore her down. It was the weight of what lay ahead, the constant worry about the settlers, about what would happen when they inevitably came. Elisa could sense that everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the land they fought so hard to keep would be threatened again. But in the quiet moments when the sun sank low in the sky and the desert winds carried with them the coolness of evening, Elisa found solace in the loom. It was the one thing that connected her to Dakota, to the life he had built here. The threads were rough under her fingers, but they were also grounding, steadying her in ways she hadn't expected. She had started to weave the first blanket following the patterns Dakota had left behind in the loom's frame, his last project, untouched, his legacy in the fabric that would someday keep someone warm. Elisa wondered if Dakota had known that his weaving would be a lifeline, not just for himself, but for her too. One afternoon, after a long day of cleaning and repairing the house, Elisa sat down beside the loom once more. The light outside had begun to dim, casting a soft glow over the room. She felt the weight of the silence around her, the quiet hum of the children's activities in the next room, and allowed herself a moment to think. Noah came in quietly, his presence steady like a shadow that hadn't quite decided whether to make itself known. He hesitated at the doorway, watching her with those dark eyes that always seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Are you going to sit there all night?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Elisa smiled softly, not looking up from the loom. "I'm not sure," she replied, pulling a thread through with a careful motion. "I find it calming. It helps me think." Noah didn't respond immediately, and Elisa could feel his gaze lingering on her. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, one that didn't need to be filled with words. "I don't know how you can stand it," he said finally, his voice softer now. "The waiting, the not knowing what's going to happen next." Elisa stopped for a moment, her fingers still on the thread. The question, simple and raw, brought with it a heaviness that made her heart ache. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in his gaze now, something that she hadn't seen before. He was just a boy trying to carry the weight of his family's survival, and Elisa wondered if he too felt as lost as she did. "I don't know either," she admitted. "But I have to keep going. For you, for all of you." Noah seemed to absorb her words, his shoulders sagging slightly, the tension he carried melting away in the quiet room. He stepped into the room, fully sitting down beside her. They worked in silence for a few moments, the sound of the loom's rhythmic clicking filling the space between them. After a while, Noah spoke again. "You know, Dakota, he was proud of this place, of what he built. Even if no one else saw it that way, he thought it was enough." His voice wavered slightly, as if testing the words before committing to them. "He never wanted to leave." Elisa's heart skipped a beat. "Do you think he ever thought about giving it up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The thought of abandoning everything they had fought for was too much for her to consider. But she had to know. She needed to understand if Dakota had ever truly believed that the land was worth the cost, that it could protect them all. Noah shook his head. "No, he never talked about it. He would have died here, I think, if the snake hadn't gotten him first." He paused, his lips tightening as he spoke. "He never gave up on it. On us." The weight of his words settled over Elisa like a blanket, warm but suffocating. Dakota had believed in this land. He had fought for it not just to survive, but to protect something that had been passed down through generations. And now Elisa realized she was part of that legacy. She was carrying it forward, whether she was ready or not. Her fingers moved with a newfound purpose, the weaving taking on a rhythm that felt almost like prayer. The tension in her chest loosened slightly, the act of weaving somehow grounding her in the present, making her feel connected to something larger than herself. As they worked side by side, Elisa realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just about surviving. It wasn't just about keeping the children alive and the land intact. It was about belonging. Dakota had made a home here in a place where few others would have chosen to settle. And now Elisa was part of that home, part of that story. It wasn't about the house or the loom or the land itself, it was about the people, the children, the family that Dakota had created from nothing but love and struggle. Elisa had come here to escape, but now she realized that what she had found wasn't just a place, it was a community. A bond forged in hardship, but one that would hold if she allowed it to. The evening wore on, and the air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the horizon. The loom's rhythm matched the beating of Elisa's heart, steady and true. She glanced at Noah, who had remained silent, his hands moving mechanically as he worked beside her. "Do you think we'll win, Elisa?" asked her voice almost a whisper. Noah didn't hesitate. "We'll have to. There's no other choice." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them settling deep within Elisa. She had thought that the fight for survival was the hardest thing she'd ever face. But now, as she sat beside Noah, weaving the threads together, She understood that the real battle wasn't just against the settlers, it was against the fear that threatened to tear them apart, against the doubt that lingered in the quiet moments. As she tied off another thread, Elisa felt the connection not just to the loom, but to Dakota's legacy. She would carry it forward not just for him, but for the children, for herself. And in doing so, she would learn to make a place for herself, here to belong to something that was bigger than any of them. They had no way of knowing what the future held, but as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Elisa knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't face it alone. She would fight, and they would fight together. For the land, for the children, for the family that Dakota had left behind. And in the end, that was enough. The storm didn't just rage in the sky, it raged inside Elisa's heart as she watched the children scramble to protect what little they had left. The sky had been clear that morning, with the sun rising like a molten coin over the distant hills. By mid-afternoon, however, the winds had picked up, shifting from a soft breeze to a gusting howl that sent the dry earth skittering across the barren land. Elisa had learned to pay attention to the signs of the desert, the way the air thickened with dust, the subtle shift in the atmosphere before a storm broke. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. It started as a small cloud on the horizon, barely noticeable against the endless blue. But within hours, the sky had darkened, the air growing heavy with the weight of impending chaos. The wind howled through the open windows of the house, rattling the wooden frames, as though trying to tear them loose from their foundations. Elisa stood at the threshold of the house, watching the clouds roll in like an army of shadows. She could feel the electricity in the air, the kind that came before a storm so fierce it would strip the land bare. Her chest tightened as she scanned the horizon, knowing that a storm like this could destroy everything. The house, the crops, the little they had left, gone in an instant. "Help me," Hanaya's voice broke through the wind, sharp with panic. Elisa spun around, her heart racing. Hanaya stood in the kitchen holding a small bundle of blankets in her arms, her face pale with fear. Behind her, the other children scrambled to gather what they could, their faces streaked with worry and desperation. They had known storms like this before, but Elisa could see the fear in their eyes. It was different this time. This wasn't just a storm. This was something worse. "What do we do?" Elisa asked, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of the wind. Hanaya's eyes were wide, her hands trembling as she shifted the blankets. "We have to secure everything. The wind's coming through the roof. We have to make sure nothing is left outside. It's going to be bad." Elisa nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She moved quickly, gathering the children into the center of the house, trying to keep them calm as the storm raged around them. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, huge, heavy drops that struck the ground like bullets, quickly turning the dry earth into a slippery, muddy mess. The wind picked up speed, carrying with it the scent of rain and dust, a bitter combination that seemed to choke the air. She could hear the wood of the house groaning under the pressure, the windows rattling in their frames as though they were going to shatter at any moment. The children huddled together, wide-eyed and frightened, while Hanaya worked to secure the roof with whatever she could find. Elisa felt the weight of the moment press down on her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about holding on to what little they had, about keeping their family safe in the face of a force they couldn't control. The storm intensified its roar, now deafening as it swept across the land. Elisa rushed to the window, her heart pounding, as she looked out into the darkening sky. The rain came down in sheets, the wind howling like a wild animal as it tore at the land. She could see the dirt swirling in the air, the landscape changing before her eyes. The storm was violent, relentless, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the world they had chosen to survive in. As the storm raged on, Elisa worked alongside the children, securing doors, windows, anything they could to protect themselves. She moved quickly, her thoughts racing, as she tried to keep her fear in check. There was no time for panic. There was only time to act, to do everything she could, to ensure that the family they had built together would serve them. "Is it going to be okay?" one of the younger children, a boy named Teo, asked in a small voice. His face was streaked with dirt, his wide eyes full of fear. Elisa knelt beside him, taking his small hand in hers. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that they would make it through this storm like they had made it through so many others. But something in her heart told her that this time it wasn't going to be that simple. "We'll be okay," she said, her voice steady even though her own heart was racing. "We have each other. We'll make it through." The wind howled again, louder this time, as though mocking her words. She turned back to the others, her eyes meeting Hanya's. The girl was still working, her face set in grim determination as she nailed down the last of the planks to the roof. Hanya's calm in the face of such chaos reminded Elisa of Dakota, the way he had carried the burden of responsibility with quiet strength. She could see that same strength in the girl, and Elisa knew that if they were going to survive, they would have to rely on each other. They would have to be strong, just like Dakota had been. The storm continued to rage outside the house, shaking with the force of the wind. Elisa could feel the pressure building in her chest, her heart pounding in her ears, as the storm's fury seemed to grow with every passing minute. It was a battle one they had no control over, but it was a battle they had to win. They worked in silence, each person focused on the task at hand, doing their part to protect what little they had left. Elisa found herself thinking of the land, of the way it had been both a curse and a blessing. She thought of Dakota's journal, the words he had written about the land, how he had fought for it, how he had believed in it. She thought of the children, the way they had learned to survive in a world that was indifferent to their existence. She thought of herself, of how she had come here to build a life only to find herself caught in a struggle she had never asked for. But she had to keep going. She had to keep fighting for them, for the children, for the land. The storm finally began to ease as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a pale, eerie light. The wind had died down and the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Elisa stood at the window looking out over the land that had withstood the storm. It was battered and broken, the once pristine earth now churned up and muddy. But it was still there, still standing, just like them. The house, too, had survived. The roof was still intact, though the wind had torn at the edges of the roof and left debris scattered across the yard. Elisa felt a deep, quiet relief settle in her chest. They had made it through, for now. The children gathered around her, their faces still pale from the storm, but slowly returning to a sense of calm. They had worked together, each one doing their part, each one contributing to the survival of their family. They had proven in the face of the storm that they were not just survivors, they were fighters. And that Elisa realized was what they needed to be. She looked down at Teo, his small hand still grasping hers, and smiled. "We made it," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. Teo smiled back, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We're okay." Elisa's heart swelled with a mix of relief and determination. The storm had passed, but the fight was far from over. The settlers were still out there, still coming for the land, for what they had. But Elisa knew now that they could face whatever came next, together. Elisa stared out at the horizon where the settlers were gathering. The battle for this land was not about land anymore. It was about survival, identity, and the right to exist. The sun had barely risen, but already the air was thick with heat. Elisa stood outside, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. where the shadows of men and wagons slowly crept across the dry land. She had heard rumors of their arrival of the settlers who were coming to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. But seeing them now in the flesh marching steadily toward the land Dakota had fought for made her stomach churn with fear. Noah stood beside her, his gaze also locked on the approaching figures. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched as he watched the dust trail behind the wagons. Elisa could feel the tension radiating off him, the silent storm brewing beneath his stoic exterior. "They're coming," Noah said, his voice rough, almost as if the words physically hurt to say. Elisa nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "I can see that," she replied quietly. "But what are we going to do?" There was no answer at first, only the sound of the wind carrying the distant noise of the settlers' movements, loud and undeniable. Elisa had never truly understood the depth of the conflict, not until now. She had come to this land to find something: hope, a family, a future. But now it seemed like all of that was about to be ripped away by people who saw the land only as a piece of property. They didn't understand it like Dakota had, like the children did. This land wasn't just earth, it was everything. "We have to stop them," Noah finally spoke, his words firm, but the fear was there in his eyes. He wasn't sure how to do it, but he knew that this was their last chance. Elisa glanced at him, seeing the raw determination in his gaze. But the truth of it hit her like a wave. Stopping them wasn't going to be easy, and in fact it might not be possible at all. The settlers were organized, they had numbers, they had the law, and the Yazzie family had nothing but a small house, a handful of children, and a few weapons to protect them. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. But the fight was not about land anymore. It was about survival. It was about the family Dakota had left behind. It was about proving that they too had a right to live here, to call this land home. "I don't know if we can stop them," Elisa said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "But I'm not going to let them take it without a fight." Noah looked at her sharply. There was a brief moment of silence before he spoke again, his voice softer now. "You don't have to do this alone, Elisa." She turned to him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, something more than the anger and fear. It was a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together, that they had no choice but to fight. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Noah, for Hanaya, for the children. She was fighting for Dakota's memory and for the future of the family that had become her own. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly, more to herself than to Noah. The wind seemed to howl in response, the sky above growing darker, with the threat of something far worse than just a storm. The settlers were close now, within a few miles of the homestead. Elisa could see them clearly, men on horseback, a few women and children all draped in the same dust-covered clothing. They were a long, silent line, their faces unreadable as they approached. The feeling of dread settled deeper into Elisa's bones. "They're not just here to settle," she whispered, a sick realization washing over her. "They're here to take everything we have." Noah nodded. "I know." The sound of galloping hooves reached their ears as a rider broke away from the line of settlers speeding toward them. Elisa's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him, one of the settlers who had been in town before trying to talk to Dakota about the land. He had never been friendly, and now as he came closer, Elisa could see the determination in his eyes. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a threat. The rider pulled his horse to a stop in front of Elisa and Noah, his face tight with impatience. "This land doesn't belong to you, Yazzie," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's been claimed by the government. It's time you packed up and left." Elisa felt her stomach tighten, the anger rising in her chest. "This land has been in Dakota's family for generations," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of her words. "It's ours. You can't just take it from us." The man sneered, his lips curling in disdain. "We'll see about that. The law says it's ours now, and I'm here to make sure you understand that. You don't belong here. You never did." No, Noah spoke, stepping forward, his voice quiet but strong. "We belong here. This land belongs to us, and we won't leave." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick as the dust swirling in the air. Elisa felt her pulse racing, her heart pounding in her chest. The rider's eyes flickered from Noah to Elisa, sizing them up. He wasn't just here to claim land. He was here to break them. "You'll regret this," the rider said, his voice filled with venom. "Pack up your things. Get off this land, or we'll be back." He spurred his horse and rode back toward the line of settlers, leaving behind only the sound of his hooves and the simmering heat of the moment. Elisa stood frozen, her heart still racing, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Noah turned to her, his face hard with resolve. "We can't let them take it." "We won't." Elisa nodded slowly, the fire in her chest growing. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through, after everything they had fought for. "We'll fight," she said, her voice steady. "But we need help. We can't do this alone." Noah looked at her, and for the first time there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We'll do whatever it takes." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, Elisa knew the battle was just beginning. But for the first time since she had arrived, she felt the weight of the land in a different way, not as a burden, but as a cause. Dakota's fight, their fight, had only just begun, and they would not lose it without everything they had. Together, they would stand against the settlers. Together, they would fight for the land, for their family, for their future. And as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Elisa knew they had no choice but to prepare for what was coming. The settlers were coming for everything they held dear, but Elisa wouldn't let them take it. She would fight for it, and so would the children. They would fight no matter what the cost. Dakota had always been a man of secrets, but the truth Elisa uncovered about his past was more dangerous than she could have imagined. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the world cloaked in a cold, gray twilight. Elisa sat alone in the small room, Dakota's journal spread open in front of her. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams settling under the weight of the night. The children were asleep, the air heavy with the quiet rhythm of their breathing. But Elisa couldn't sleep. Not tonight. She had spent hours reading through Dakota's journal, the words smudged and fading with age, but the weight of them only grew heavier with each page she turned. It wasn't just the stories of his life, his battles with the settlers, his pride in the land he had tried to protect. It was something darker. Something she hadn't expected to find. Secrets that Dakota had kept even from his own family, secrets that if anyone else knew could destroy everything they had worked for. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the last entry, a note that Dakota had written just days before his death. "I've made mistakes. I didn't want this life for them, but the land is ours and I can't let go. Amarog thinks I'm a fool, and maybe he's right. But I'll fight until the end. I have to. If I don't, they'll lose everything." The last few words echoed in her mind. They'll lose everything. The weight of that sentence felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on her chest. Elisa didn't understand. She had thought Dakota had fought for the land, for the children, for their future. But now, reading between the lines of his words, she realized that Dakota's reasons had been more complicated than she could have imagined. She had believed that Dakota's death was a tragic accident, a random strike from nature, a snakebite that had taken him too soon. But now she wasn't so sure. It was as if Dakota had known his time was running out. And as much as he had fought for the land, it seemed like he was carrying a burden, something he had been hiding from everyone. Why didn't he tell me, Elisa whispered to herself, the journal feeling heavier with each passing second. Why didn't he tell us? Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock on the door. Elisa's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. It was still early in the night, and the storm had passed hours ago. She hadn't expected anyone. She quickly closed the journal, pushing it aside as she rose to answer the door. The figure standing in the doorway wasn't one she had expected to see. It was Amarog. His face was shadowed by the dim light, but Elisa could see the hardened look in his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just stood there in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching between them, like a fragile thread waiting to snap. "What are you doing here?" Elisa finally asked, her voice hesitant, but firm. "It's late." Amarog took a step forward, his eyes flickering toward the journal on the table, but he didn't say anything about it. He was quiet, his movements deliberate as he stepped into the room. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and rough. "It's about Dakota." Elisa's heart sank. She hadn't expected this conversation. Not now, not with everything that had already happened. But something in his tone told her that this was important. Something that couldn't wait. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with both curiosity and dread. Amarog hesitated, his eyes flickering with something, regret perhaps, or guilt. "I've kept things from you. Things I should have told you earlier." Elisa's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What things? Amarog stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Dakota wasn't just protecting the land. He was protecting something else. A secret. Something that could have destroyed everything if anyone knew about it. Elisa's pulse quickened as her mind raced. What could Dakota have kept hidden? What secret was he carrying? And why hadn't he told her or anyone else about it? She felt a cold dread settle deep in her chest. "What secret?" Elisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Amarog's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer. "There's a letter Dakota wrote to me. It's hidden, buried in the attic. It's about the land, about the settlers. But it's more than that. It's about who really owns this land." Dakota wasn't just fighting for his family. He was fighting for something else. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. She had known there was more to Dakota's story, more to the land, but this was something different, something darker. She felt her hands tremble as she struggled to process the words. What was Amarog talking about? What could be so dangerous, so catastrophic, that Dakota had hidden it from his own family? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Elisa demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "Why wait until now?" Amarog's gaze softened, a flicker of regret passing through his eyes. "I couldn't. I was afraid of what would happen if you knew. I was afraid of what it would do to the children, to this place. To you." Elisa stared at him, her mind reeling with the implications of his words. She had trusted Dakota had come here because of the life he had promised. But now everything was being torn apart by secrets, by things Dakota had hidden from everyone, including her. "I need to see this letter," Elisa said, her voice shaking with urgency. "I need to know the truth." Amarog nodded slowly, his face darkening with the weight of what was to come. "It's in the attic. I'll show you." The two of them moved through the house in silence, Elisa's heart racing with every step. She could feel the weight of what was about to unfold, the truth that had been hidden from her, from everyone for so long. What was Dakota hiding, and why had he kept it buried for so long? They reached the attic door, and Amarog gestured for her to go ahead. Elisa's hands trembled as she reached for the latch, pushing the door open. The attic was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might be important. Amarog moved past her, pulling open a small wooden chest in the corner. He carefully lifted a bundle of old papers, the edges yellowed with age. He turned to Elisa, his face tense. "This is it," he said, handing her the letter. "Everything Dakota kept from you." Elisa took the letters from him, her hands trembling as she unfolded the brittle paper. She read the words slowly, her eyes scanning each line as her heart pounded in her chest. The letter was written in Dakota's hand, the words shaky as though he had written them in haste, knowing that time was running out. It was a confession, a revelation about the land and its ownership, about who had really laid claim to it, and about the dangerous game Dakota had been forced to play to protect what little he had left. As Elisa read, the ground beneath her seemed to shift the world around her, crumbling as the truth sank in. The battle for the land wasn't just about settlers. It was about power manipulation and a past that had been buried too deeply to ignore. Her breath caught in her throat as she finished reading, the weight of the letter settling heavily in her chest. Dakota had fought not just for his family, but for a future he had known was fragile. And now Elisa was left to face the consequences of those secrets. Consequences that could destroy everything they had worked for. She turned to Amarog, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What now?" she whispered. Amarog's face was grim, his voice steady. "Now we fight. But we fight with the truth. The land was more than just earth beneath our feet. It was history, blood, and survival. And I would fight for it for them." The day had come. Elisa could feel it in the air, the heavy stillness that hung like a storm just before the first strike. The settlers were nearing. The scouts had spotted them just a few miles away, and now Elisa stood at the edge of their homestead, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. But Elisa could only focus on the shapes that moved in the distance. She knew what was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Noah, standing beside her, was already at work, preparing his movements quick and efficient. He was ready, his face set in determination. But Elisa could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that came from knowing the odds. The settlers had numbers. They had weapons. They had the law on their side. And what did they have? A few weapons, a small house, and a family that had learned to survive by the skin of their teeth. They were outmatched, outnumbered, but they had something more. They had each other. She had spent the last few days preparing too. She had gone over every inch of the land, with Amarog, learning what they could do to defend it, to protect the children, and the future they had all built here. But each plan felt like a fragile hope, something that could be shattered at the first blow. The settlers would come. The question was whether they could hold them off long enough to make a difference. Amarog appeared from behind the house, his face grim but resolute. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to reassure Elisa that they weren't alone in this fight. He had been part of Dakota's life, part of the history of this land. And now he was here to help her keep it. "We'll hold them off as long as we can," Amarog said, his voice low and steady. "But we need to be ready. They're coming with everything they have." Elisa nodded, tightening her grip on the rifle she had learned to handle over the past few days. It felt heavy in her hands, but it was a weight she had come to accept. This was her life now. There would be no turning back. As the hours passed, the air grew thick with anticipation. Elisa could feel her pulse quicken with every minute, every breath that seemed to stretch longer than the last. The children were gathered inside the house, out of sight, out of harm's way, but Elisa knew it wouldn't be enough to keep them safe if the settlers decided to take what they wanted by force. She had to do more than just hide. She had to protect them. Protect everything that Dakota had left behind. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. Elisa's heart stopped for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. The first wave had arrived. Noah was already at the ready, his body tense as he aimed his rifle toward the approaching figures. The dust kicked up by the horses blurred the line of sight, but Elisa could see the riders clearly, now men on horseback, their faces hardened with the promise of conquest. "They're here," Amarog said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's time." Elisa looked around, her mind racing for a plan, for a way to hold them off long enough to make them realize that this was not their land to take. She had no illusions. They weren't going to convince these men to leave peacefully. This would be a fight for survival, for everything they had worked for. "Get ready," she said to Noah, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "Do not fire unless I tell you." Noah nodded, his eyes dark with resolve. He was ready. They all were. The riders slowed as they approached, their faces steely and unreadable. Elisa could feel the weight of their gaze as they circled the house, sizing up their opponents. The tension in the air was thick, and Elisa held her breath, waiting for the first move. Finally, the leader of the group, an older man with graying hair and a hard face, pulled his horse to a stop in front of them. He looked at Elisa, then at Amarog, his eyes narrowing as he sized them up. "You're not welcome here," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "This land belongs to the government now. You're trespassing." Elisa didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. "This land has been in my family for generations," she said, her voice strong, though her hands were shaking. "We will not leave." The man's lip curled into a sneer, his eyes flicking to the rifle in her hands. "You'll regret this," he spat. "We've got the law on our side. We'll take what's ours." Elisa held her ground, her grip tightening on the rifle. She had no illusions about the law. The settlers had it in their pocket, and if it came to a fight, the law would side with them. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. The fight wasn't about land ownership or rights. It was about survival. It was about proving that they had a right to live here, to stand on this land and call it home. "We won't give up without a fight," she said, her voice unwavering. "We will defend this land, and we will defend our family." The man's eyes darkened, and for a moment Elisa thought he might draw his weapon. But instead, he just nodded once, a grim recognition of the battle that was about to take place. "Then we'll see how long you last," he said, before turning his horse and signaling for the rest of the riders to move forward. The riders spread out, taking positions around the house, their eyes constantly moving, their weapons at the ready. Elisa felt her heart race, but she kept her focus, watching their every move, waiting for the signal. Amarog moved to her side, his face set in grim determination. "They're trying to break us," he said quietly. "But they don't know us. They don't know what we'll do to protect this place." Elisa nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "We'll fight for it," she said, her voice steady, "and we'll win." The first shot rang out, the sharp crack of gunfire slicing through the tense silence. Elisa's pulse spiked, and she raised her rifle, taking aim at the closest rider. But it wasn't her shot that rang out first. It was Noah's. The sound of gunfire echoed in the air, followed by the yells of men as they scrambled for cover. The battle had begun. It was no longer about just defending the house. It was about holding on to everything they had. Everything Dakota had left them. And Elisa would fight with everything she had to make sure they didn't lose it. The dust kicked up around them as the fight escalated the land beneath their feet, shaking with every shot fired. Elisa's heart raced, but there was no turning back now. The settlers were coming for everything they had, and they weren't going to let them take it without a fight. The legacy of Takota Yazzie was not in the land or the loom, it was in the children, in the lives we had saved, in the future we had built together. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the homestead. The wind, once violent and merciless, had finally calmed, leaving behind an eerie stillness in the air. Elisa stood outside, her gaze sweeping over the landscape that had become so familiar to her. She could still feel the echoes of the battle that had raged through the day. The sounds of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, the dust that had filled the air like a choking cloud. But now, as the evening light softened the harsh edges of the world, there was peace. It wasn't a peace that came easily. It wasn't the kind of peace that meant all was well. But it was a peace that meant they had survived. They had fought for the land, for their home, and they had won. Elisa felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to find Noah standing behind her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his expression soft. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something, reassurance perhaps, or just a sense of shared understanding. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse from the day's ordeal. Elisa nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't have the words for how she felt. There was a relief in her chest, but it was tempered by the weight of what had happened. They had fought off the settlers, but it wasn't over. The land was still theirs for now, but the fight was far from finished. There would be more battles ahead, and Elisa knew that. The legacy of Takota's struggle was far from over, but for now they had won, and that was enough. "We did it," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah's hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment longer, before he stepped back, his gaze turning to the horizon. The children were gathering inside the house, their voices low and tired, but filled with the relief that came with knowing they were safe. The battle had taken its toll on all of them, but they had held their ground. Takota's legacy had been protected, at least for now. Amarog approached, his face drawn and weary. He had fought alongside them, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of the day. He had proven himself not just a brother to Takota, but a protector of the family they had all become. There was a bond between them now, one forged in the fire of their shared struggle. "We've done what we could." Amarog said, his voice quiet but firm. "But this land, this fight, it's not over. It won't be over until we make sure that no one can take it from us." Elisa turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. She knew he was right. This wasn't a one-time victory. This was just the beginning. The settlers had been pushed back for now, but there were others out there, others who would come, who would try to take what they had built. The land was still in danger. But for the first time, Elisa felt a sense of hope. A hope that had been hard to come by in the days leading up to the battle. They had fought together, and they had won. And that victory had given her something she hadn't realized. She needed faith in herself, in the family that had become her own. She had come here with a purpose, a dream of a life with Takota. But that dream had changed, had evolved into something deeper. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the children, for the legacy that Takota had left behind. She was fighting for their future, and that made all the difference. "We'll keep fighting." Elisa said, her voice steady, the weight of her words settling over her like a cloak. "For them. For all of us." Amarog nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've become part of this family, Elisa, and we fight together." The words hung in the air, and Elisa felt their truth deep in her bones. This was no longer just a fight for land. It was a fight for something more. It was a fight for family, for survival, for a future they could all share. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elisa turned back toward the house, the soft glow of the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. The house, battered but still standing, seemed to glow with a quiet resilience, a symbol of everything they had fought for. The loom still in its place by the window felt like a thread that connected them all, past, present, and future. Dakota's spirit lingered in every corner of the home, in every thread that had been woven into the fabric of their lives. Inside, the children were gathered around the fire, their faces tired but peaceful. Hanaya sat with her arms around her younger siblings, her protective nature as strong as ever. Teo, the youngest boy, looked up at Elisa with a shy smile, as if he had finally found some measure of comfort in the chaos of the world around him. Elisa sat down beside them, the weight of the day slowly lifting from her shoulders. For a moment, everything felt still, quiet, and safe, like a breath held just before the storm. The children were safe. They were home. And for now, that was enough. Noah joined them, his face softer now, the hardness that had marked his expression earlier in the day gone. He sat beside Hanaya, and the two of them shared a look that spoke volumes, silent understanding, silent gratitude. Amarog stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before he too came to sit with them. There was a quiet respect in his movements, as though he knew this moment of peace was fleeting but necessary. They had fought for this, for the right to be together, to stand as a family. "We've made it this far," Elisa said, her voice breaking the silence, her words a simple declaration of the truth that had been building inside her. "And we'll keep going. We'll keep fighting for each other. For this family." The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room as the night settled in around them. Elisa sat back, watching the children, watching the family she had found in this land. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about building something that couldn't be taken away. And as she looked at the faces around her, Elisa knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The legacy of Dakota Yazi wasn't just in the land or the loom. It was in the children and the lives they had saved, in the future they had built together. And that, Elisa realized, was enough. Enough to keep fighting for. Enough to make it through whatever came next. Together. In the end, it wasn't just the land we fought for, it was each other. And together, we had built something stronger than any storm. The morning light filtered through the cracked windows, casting soft beams across the floor of the house. It had been a week since the battle with the settlers had ended, and although the land was still theirs, the scars of the fight were evident everywhere, on the house, on the people, and in Elisa's heart. The dust from the battlefield had settled, but there was still a lingering tension in the air, as though the storm had only just passed, leaving behind its wreckage in quiet reverence. Elisa stood at the window, gazing out at the now quiet landscape. The land that had seemed so vast, so intimidating, was now a reminder of everything they had fought for. The wind had softened, and the sun was beginning to warm the earth, but Elisa couldn't shake the weight of the past days, the adrenaline, the fear, the uncertainty. The battle was over, but the world had changed. She had changed. She hadn't expected the aftermath to feel like this. The fight for the land had been fierce, but the silence that followed felt even more intense. What had started as a mission to preserve Dakota's legacy had now become a fight for something even deeper, something more personal. The land had been the catalyst, but it was the people, the family she had found here, that kept her standing. It wasn't just the house or the land she had inherited. It was the lives she had come to protect. Turning away from the window, Elisa looked around the house. It had been repaired as much as it could be, but the memories of the fight lingered in every corner. The walls, now patched and reinforced, bore the marks of the struggle just as the people did. The children had resumed their routines, quiet, unspoken, but with a newfound sense of hope. Hanaya and Noah were once again looking after their younger siblings, their roles cemented by the trials they had faced. The bond between them had been strengthened by the battle. They had fought side by side, and they had won. Elisa walked into the main room where the children were gathered. Teo was sitting on the floor playing with a few sticks he had found outside while the others sat around the fire talking quietly. The warmth of the fire filled the room, but it was the warmth of the family that made Elisa feel the most at ease. This was what Dakota had fought for. This was what he had protected. And now she was a part of it, woven into the fabric of this place, this family. She smiled as she watched Hanaya and Noah exchange a few words, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. There was a new understanding between them, a shared recognition of the strength they had discovered in one another. They had faced the worst together, and they had survived. Elisa felt a pang of gratitude for them, for the children, for everything that had come together in the wake of the storm. They had come through the battle, and they had emerged stronger than ever. Hanaya looked up and caught Elisa's gaze, offering a small smile. Elisa's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just the children who had changed. It was her too. She had come here expecting to be part of someone else's story. But in the end, she had become part of this one. She had fought for this family, for the land, and for the future they would build together. It had taken everything she had, her strength, her resolve, her heart, but in the end, it was worth it. They were worth it. "Are you all right?" Noah asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He had moved to stand next to her, his expression soft, but there was still a hint of concern in his eyes. Elisa nodded, forcing herself to focus on the present. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Noah studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering. Then, with a quiet nod, he stepped back, returning to his place near the fire. Elisa knew he understood. The weight of everything they had been through still hung between them, but there was no more need for words. They had said everything that needed to be said during the battle. Now it was time to move forward. As the evening wore on, Elisa found herself sitting at the table with Hanaya, sorting through the remnants of Dakota's belongings. The loom, though no longer used, sat in the corner, its wooden frame still a silent witness to Dakota's legacy. The quilts, Dakota had woven the blankets. The baskets, they were all part of the story. And Elisa had inherited that story just as she had inherited the land. "I think Dakota would be proud of us," Hania said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the blankets. "We've kept it all together. We've fought for it." Elisa smiled, the sadness in her chest softening just a little. "He would be proud," she agreed. "But we're not done yet. We still have a future to build." The words hung in the air for a moment, filled with possibility. They had won the battle for the land, but the real work was just beginning. They had a future to create, a future that would honor Dakota's memory, but also build something new, something stronger. Elisa didn't know exactly what that future would look like, but she knew it would be one they would build together, with each other, with love, and with determination. Later that night, as the children settled into their beds, Elisa stood by the window again, looking out over the land. The moon was high in the sky, casting its silvery light across the earth. The world was quiet now, peaceful in a way that it hadn't been in a long time. She could feel Dakota's presence in the air, in the land, in the family, that had grown from the soil he had worked so hard to protect. She wasn't just standing on this land anymore. She was part of it. She had fought for it. She had fought for them. And in the end, it wasn't just the land they had won. It was each other. Elisa turned away from the window, a sense of peace settling over her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. They had survived. They had won. And together they would build something stronger than any storm.